But before we start getting into the root ball and seeing what's going on with the root system, I want to talk a little bit about structural pruning and any pruning that would or would not be advisable at this point. So we have a Japanese maple here. This would be true for any species, in my opinion, that you would be working with. At the time of planting, it's not advisable to do any major pruning. Certainly if there's any dead wood that you want to remove, any stub cuts, which there are a couple on this, anything like that that you wanted to clean up, that would be fine. But you don't want to get into doing any major, even if it is structural, you typically don't want to get into that. So we're going to keep pruning to a low minimum and just concentrate on removing some dead wood, and then we'll come back in about a year from now after it's had time to establish and address any other more serious or major structural pruning that might be necessary. Looking at this tree in this container, there's no way for me to readily know or to definitively know where the root flare is. And if you think back to when we were looking at the large oak at the beginning of the section, you could see the buttress roots, that flare coming out. That's what I'm talking about. That's where your buttress roots, the point where your buttress roots are emerging from the stem tissue. We want that at or slightly above grade. There's no way for me to tell where that actually is, for me to know the proper planting depth until I get my hands in there and actually start looking at it. So before we make a mark with a shovel and start removing soil, we're going to actually get into that root ball and see what we're looking at and see what kind of hole. Likely it's going to be a much shallower hole than the depth of that container that we're looking with, because most plant material, whether it's balled and burlapped or in a container, there to some depth it's highly likely that it's going to be planted too deeply. For a researcher, something like this is much akin to Christmas morning because now we get to open this up and we get to see what's underneath. So I'm going to cut this twine. I won't belabor this, but a great deal of research has been done, and the bottom line of it is that root balls in general are not as fragile as we had thought they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. So yes, I'm going to disturb the root ball before I plant it. I'm going to start pulling some of this soil away just to see where my roots are. Lots of times too, when you're working with trees that have been grafted, that's something else you have to pay attention to, or trees that may have just been pruned for various reasons down around the stem. People will plant soil up above that point because it's aesthetically unpleasing, and that is a mistake. That's actually part of the stem, and stems were made to be out in the air, and roots were made to be underground. And you see I've already removed a fair amount of soil, and we haven't come to the first root yet. If this were a container tree, I would still be doing the same thing. I would be removing that soilless media in the container to get to a point where I could find the root flare. Here's our first root. Right down there. So we're what, about 3.5 or 4 inches down? So if we had planted that tree where the soil line was, it would be what we would be continuing what had started in the nursery, and that would be that we would have a buried root collar, which is a slow death for a plant. So again, I realize some people are probably horrified that I'm removing this soil and that I'm disturbing this like I am, but please remember that pull back, and we're looking at creating a plant and a soil environment for the longest life possible of a plant, and some of it does go against what we grew up being taught. So when it gets to the part of digging, actually preparing the site, and you're ready to put your tree in, you've gone through species selection based on the history of your site, and what you feel like is going to have wonderful opportunity for a long-lived life, then you're ready to start digging. And depending on your site, you have different options. Most do-it-yourselfers, it's probably going to be a shovel. If you are hiring someone to do it and it's a larger tree, like a larger B&B tree, that would be being set down in a hole, then you're likely to have a spade. Some people will use augers. Things to be aware of if you're using spade or an auger is making sure that that soil around the edge does not dry out. It's called glazing, and that can create an interface that can create a problem for root penetration and water movement potentially. But certainly for this tree, a shovel is going to do it, and that's quite sufficient for the size tree that we're working with today. This would also be the time where you would want to be sure that you had on site, if you needed to make amendments to your soil, if you needed to add organic matter, you would want to have that on site so that you could incorporate it as you're digging the hole. My grandfather used to always say, dig a $100 hole for a $10 tree, and I think that's pretty sound advice. Here, I really don't have to be concerned about that because, as I said earlier, this is a small tree. It's only ever going to be maybe 6 to 8 feet tall, and that's going to be a long time from now. And it's not going to have the same root system that the oak did earlier, obviously, that we looked at. It's not going to be an expansive root system. And it has plenty of space here to spread out. So I'm not going to add anything. The soil is good. I'm just going to dig a site that's appropriate to that root ball. When you think you're almost there, get your plant material and test it out. And I'm happy with that. When you backfill, you don't want these clods of clay. You want to break those up. Have a source of water while you're planting. If you do have a specimen where you have roots that you can spread out readily into the landscape and you end up digging a wider hole, the water really helps if you do it as you're planting to create superb root to soil contact, which helps with stability and it helps with the establishment of the tree as well, or the plant material. What you want to avoid, and which is why we want to break up as many of those clods as possible, is because if you don't, then you're likely to get big air pockets down in the soil. And that's not good news because it can cause the roots to dry out and die off in those areas. What you want to do, ideally, is backfill and then, and with a shower head, not just with a straight blasting it with a straight hose, but with a shower head attachment is how I would refer to it, like this, like a spray. That will help that soil settle in, and it makes great root to soil contact with Bareroot plant material. It's helps with stability, but it also helps in establishing the root system out into the landscape. So you're just backfilling a little bit, trying to mind. It also helps with those air pockets that we were talking about. And yay, I'm stable enough it can stand on its own now. I don't like that big clod right there. I'm going to give it another round of water, especially around the base where I know that some of those larger woody roots are, where there may be potential for air pockets. Some people call this a slurry. We tend to be more casual. We call mudding it in. And it basically is like making a mud pie. But it does make for really good stability. I'm slightly off center or leaning a little bit. And it's really easy doing it this way too, to readjust as you're planting. If you're backfilling a little bit at a time, it leaves you some mobility to tweak things.